we can turn to Tracey Mallaghan, Insulate Britain's spokesperson. Tracey, thank you very much for joining us here on the briefing on GB News. Firstly, have you been arrested so far?
Yes, I have. I was out on the roads on Tuesday.
And that was the first and only time you've been arrested throughout this protest, but you seem to have got out relatively quickly. And will you be back on the roads?
Yes, although we may be used to leaders not following their, words with actions, Insulate Britain, we are committed to being steadfast. As soon as a meaningful statement is released, we will get off the roads.
What do you mean by that, a meaningful statement?
Oh, I think you know what I mean. We're all used to being told things and then not seeing the action come through. This problem of insulation has been kicked about for 2 decades, hasn't it? So we don't want empty words. We want Boris, similar to what he was saying when he spoke to the UN, I was really quite proud of him. Can't believe I'm saying that for
You were
acknowledging.
proud of Boris Johnson, were you?
I know, right? But he admitted, he said sorry for adding to the climate denial that's got us into such a mess. And he acknowledged what an emotional problem, difficulty it is to accept the
Well, this
severity
is
of the crisis
remarkably
we're in.
magnanimous of you, Tracey Mallaghan. Could you potentially, in this magnanimous mood, recognise that the United Kingdom has done more than any G20 country in the last 30 years to lessen CO2 emissions?
Oh, come on, that's not quite true, is it? A lot of what our CO2, that we use to produce our goods and stuff is done in other countries. So that's not really accurate to say that.
Well,
I do
it
think,
clearly is. Lots of countries do importing. If we're comparing to similar first world countries, clearly the United Kingdom has done a huge amount to reduce CO2. And I just wonder why it is that we seem to have very, very intense climate action in this country, clearly a world leader in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. When you look at countries like Canada, for example, that have actually been on the wrong trend in recent years in terms of their CO2 output, there's basically no movement at all.
Oh, come on. Boris himself said at that UN conversation he'd got things wrong. He'd join in with the climate denial. And do you know what I hear as a mum when people say things like that? It sounds a little bit like, oh, but mum, everyone else is doing it. And that didn't get my kids anywhere. We did start the Industrial Revolution, right? And a lot of people seem to feel shame about that. And we don't have to if we accept that it had consequences we didn't intend and we agree to get on with the job. We only have to feel ashamed of that if we keep denying that it's a problem. If we come up with the right solutions, other countries will follow us, just like they, came over here to learn how to make steel and stuff. So I do think that we can show the right way.
I'm sure that it seems peculiar here because you seem to be saying relatively sensible things now, but then when it comes to actually acting about it, you go and lie in a road, and I'm just not quite sure how lying in a road is really going to help anyone when it comes to this conversation. Now, I follow someone on Twitter, a former member of Extinction Rebellion. You might know her, she's called Zion Lights, and she actually left Extinction Rebellion and is now doing something proactive. She's going around the country campaigning in favour of nuclear power. Why don't you do something like that? Why don't you join her campaign to do something that would actually lessen the CO2 in this country? Rather than, and you mentioned that you're a mother, blocking roads, blocking families, blocking potentially ambulances, maybe causing accidents, causing chaos. Why don't you do something useful instead?
I am just a mum and I'm very new to this game. I hadn't even heard of the climate crisis or activism. I thought Swampy was a bit of a div. I had a lot of things wrong in my own head. But what we've seen and the people I've met for decades, we've tried all the normal forms of protest. The government have shut them down. This level of disruption is needed because we're talking about saving over 8,000 people dying from the choice between heating or eating that's been ignored for decades.
I just find
so we do need to get on with the job.
I find this extraordinary. The United Kingdom, well before you decided to lie in any roads, is hosting COP26. Boris Johnson just flew across the Atlantic to galvanise the world, to come to Glasgow in a couple of months' time, to try and reach an accord that will actually lessen the amount of CO2 in the world and reach net zero. And many countries have followed the UK, the first country in the world to commit to net zero. That all happened before your group started lying in roads. Do you think you've actually changed anything at all?
Yeah, I think what Boris Johnson said, I think we can all agree it was a bit difficult to hear Boris telling everyone to grow up while he talked about romper rooms, the Muppets, and that he personally had treated the world like his own personal toy. But like I said, he also told some truth. This is a huge crisis. It's emotionally really difficult to understand the state that we're in, and the solutions are in coming together,
But
being
Tracey,
truthful
just
about it.
answer the question there. Do you think that anything that's happened over the last 6 months with this government has actually been influenced by deciding to block the port of Dover?
For sure, right? So I heard about that our government, our parliament, had declared a climate emergency in October 19, and I heard that because of protesters. There was a couple of seconds on the news, and I couldn't believe it. What do you mean my government's declared an emergency and I don't know? So I went onto a website, and it's true. They declared it in May, but the media hadn't got on board. The government hadn't sent out messaging to everyone, and that horrified me. And I didn't want to be a protester, so then I went to a council meeting. And one of those councillors said, we can't tell people the truth unless we make it happy because people will get depressed and do nothing. And what you're seeing here is that not all of us will get depressed and do nothing.
But you're not doing anything.
We have to do this for our children.
You're not doing anything. You're just sitting in roads, blocking cars, actually probably causing more pollution by making tailbacks of idling cars. What people that are doing things are those that are actually influencing policy, those that are, for example, promoting reliable energy for the future. I mean, we're importing foreign energy right now that carries much more CO2 because we've invested probably too much in wind in the North Sea. The wind hasn't blown for the last 2 months. We've got a bit of an energy crisis on our hands. Why don't you come together with some sensible people and, for example, back nuclear power?
Look, sweetheart, I think it's historically illiterate to say that protest hasn't shifted some of these really difficult conscious shifts and changes around. Look, we're asking for something really simple, aren't we? Stop the needless death from people having to choose between heating and eating.
So you're asking to stop needless death by people having to choose between heating and eating, and yet it's really the bills that have been soaring off the back of moving from cheap energy to expensive energy. And it's groups like yours that have encouraged more expensive energy that's been hardest for the poorest people in this country. Why don't you, and I ask you now for the 4th or 5th time, why don't you get behind something like nuclear power, which can be a reliable, steady, clean form of energy and can actually work for the people of this country?
Look, you're talking about the people who are in fuel poverty and the people, this is my people, this is me. I know people who are going to be affected and having to make that choice. Do I feed my kids or do I heat the house? Right? We all need to get on with the job, and insulation is the simplest thing that we should be getting on with. There should be an easy plan. It should be simple for Boris to say, here's a meaningful statement, and we'll get off the roads.
This is extraordinary. Working people up and down this country have had their lives disrupted by your group for a long time. People are seeing their energy bills rising, and groups like yours are really contributing to those worries and those cost increases for families up and down the country. Why don't you take the moment here to apologise for people up and down this country, to say sorry, to get off the roads, and instead to sit down in a meeting with people and try and get this sorted in a way that doesn't ruin the lives and ruin the days and potentially cause a quite great deal of anxiety, stress, and indeed accidents on our roads?
I'm sorry, sweetheart, you did it again. You othered those people who are making the choice between heating and eating. That's my friends, my family.
And why don't you apologise to your friends and family for making them have that choice?
I am heartbroken that we're in this dilemma, but if none of us get out there and draw a line in the sand and say, come on, we have to be brave, just like Boris was saying yesterday, we have to start getting on with what's necessary, not keep having debates and talking about it. Let all of the climate
get what he means when he says that we need to make action, that means that we actually need to do things. Lying in the road is the opposite of doing something. That's obstructing things. That's stopping things. The kind of people that are solving the climate crisis are the innovators, are the scientists, are those that are working within our dynamic market economy to innovate our way out of this crisis. The inventors of the LED light, they are the kind of people that are actually doing the work that's going to help. All you're doing is ruining people's days and then patting yourselves on the back, thinking that you've done something. You're not doing anything at all.
Oh, I'm not patting myself on the back. This is emotionally traumatic. Look, For 2 decades, the government have been failing to get a serious programme to insulate all our homes. Any serious report about the mess we're in says that insulating houses is the #1 thing to be getting on with. So we've got a simple demand.
Why doesn't your
easy
leader
for
insulate
us
his
to go
own
with it. You know,
house? Why doesn't your leader insulate his own
that's
house?
such a ridiculous thing to say. Right.
You
so
are a
we all
group.
know
You
that
are
the
a
chain,
group that is
a chain
relatively
is
well
strongest
funded.
by-
Many of your members have property portfolios. You're not exactly strapped for cash, and yet your own leader refuses to insulate his own house. What kind of example does that set?
He didn't refuse it. He's trying to make you understand the bigger picture, right? The chain is strongest.
He's trying to make us understand the bigger... A lot of people are going to listen to this and think that, what on earth are you trying to do? It's not about insulation at all, is it? You want to change the fundamentals of our economy. You want to change the way that our world works. And I've heard you try and condescend to me 3 times, and I'm not going to take it, because all that you're doing here is trying to build a new socialist economy. You're trying to take away the system that has generated wealth and happiness for the kind of families that you are now driving up the bills of and causing havoc for in their lives. This isn't about insulation at all, is it?
Oh, not at all. Look, I'm a mum. I didn't go to uni. I don't really understand these bigger concepts like socialism and capitalism. But what I do know is that if you ignore a problem, it doesn't go away. And the mess we're in today is because our government has failed to address the problems they've been warned about. Our Prime Minister contributed to climate denial. You know, for 2 decades, we've been allowing over 8,000 people to die because of the choice between heating or eating. Do you really care about those people, or are you just trying to make me look an idiot and yourself feel better?
Look, you've started to repeat yourself again and again. I'm starting to think that there's nothing more than sort of media-trained platitudes here. I've asked you some substantive questions. You've refused to say whether you back nuclear power or not. You've refused to talk about practical solutions to this. And indeed, you've batted away the idea...
There's nothing more practical than insulating our homes.
Away the idea that your leader doesn't
says.
insulate his own house. I think many people listening to this conversation here today will think that this group is nothing more than a front for something that wants to fundamentally change our way of life. Advocating policies and advocating the kind of state intervention in people's lives that will make people's lives miserable, less free and more poor. I wonder why it is that you have avoided so many of these questions that have been put to you today.
And
I think that people will draw their own conclusions from this conversation. But Tracey Mallaghan, I thank you for your time.
You have a very bad impression of British people.
And I hope that people will be able to make their own minds up about this conversation. Thank you for joining us here today. Right, let's now talk to a lawyer on this whole situation, because Nick Freeman, you have been listening to that conversation and you understand the criminal defence and motoring law behind this situation. And a lot of people sitting at home will be thinking, why on earth can the police not simply get in faster and remove these idiots from the road forthwith?
Yeah, good afternoon, Tom. The first offence that's obviously been committed is obstructing the highways. That's dealt with ultimately by a maximum financial penalty of £1,000. So what happens is the police arrest these people within 24 hours. They're back on the roads, glued to the tarmac or wherever. It's ineffective. It doesn't work. And that's why the government, through the National Highways, has applied for this injunction. What we really need is emergency legislation.
Yes.
There is a proposal to make public nuisance a criminal offence, but that's going to take time, and we need something rapid. So at the moment, what's happened is the government's been granted an injunction, and at the moment it just relates to the M25, the slip roads, the bridges, to prevent certain named people from attending, to prevent any right of protest there at all. But of course, it's in a specific area, and what's happened is the protesters, who are obviously quite cognizant of the current law, have moved now to Dover, and that's why we need some emergency legislation to deal with this. Otherwise, this is going to cost the economy not millions but billions of pounds.
It's extraordinary how
purpose
few people have been able to cause such large disruption. This is a group that seems relatively well-funded, made up of well-heeled and quite often octogenarian members themselves who feel like they've got little to lose. I was speaking actually to Tracey Mallaghan just before you, who'd been arrested herself, but very quickly got out. Why on earth can't we keep these people behind bars when we know all they're going to do is get out and reoffend?
Yeah, well, that's exactly why the government's now got an injunction. So the effect of that is that if these people, I'm not sure whether the lady you were speaking to before is named in the injunction, but it doesn't matter if she is or she isn't. If anyone actually breaches that injunction and goes in the area of the M25, they will be arrested and taken before the court for contempt of court. The maximum sentence, of course, there is 2 years, and it has an unlimited fine. So
they've just not gone to the M25. They're clearly very aware of that, and they've moved to Dover. And if there's an injunction placed on Dover, they'll move somewhere else. So what is this specific legislation you're calling for now?
Well, we need emergency legislation to deal specifically with this. So in effect, because the problem the government have, Tom, is that they cannot interfere completely with the right to peaceful protest, and that's why they've limited it to this area. But I think the events of this afternoon today have illustrated that unless they actually grasp this nettle and impose some restriction whereby there is literally an injunction against this particular group and certain individuals across the entire country, then they will be able to bring the country to a halt. And it's necessary and it's proportionate in these particular circumstances. And then these particular individuals will have to make a very clear decision. Do they want to risk prison with the obvious consequences that flows? And do they want to risk having an unlimited fine? As you indicated, they seem to be fairly well-to-do. Some of them are octogenarians. They seem to be quite intelligent. This is obviously carefully prepared. The government needs to be one step ahead, and they need emergency legislation. There's no point saying, well, look, there's a new police and sentencing bill coming out, and the idea is to make public nuisance a criminal offence. It's going to take too long. It's going to cost us too much in terms of disruption, finances, etc., etc. So we need this emergency legislation literally now, so that it's ready tomorrow or on Monday morning. And then these people will be dealt with in a proportionate way, so that if they cause the mayhem that they are currently causing, they will feel the full arm of the law. And at the moment, you know, they're ridiculing the government, they're ridiculing the police, and they're ridiculing the public. And I don't think really they're enhancing their own cause, the cause they claim to represent. It may well be, as you've indicated, another cause that's underlying. That's not for me to comment on. But they are causing mayhem and costing us an awful lot of money.
And they're clearly quite aware of what's going on in the political world, because, of course, Parliament is no longer sitting for another couple of weeks as we go into conference recess. So no legislation going to be in the foreseeable future for the next few weeks. I wonder what else is it that we can do? Because a lot of people will be sitting here and thinking that, of course, people should have the right to protest. But the right to protest doesn't involve breaking the law. You don't have a right to break the law, whether that's smashing windows or obstructing highways. Well,
you're right, and these people are breaking the law as it currently stands, and they're causing, in certain circumstances, criminal damage, and they're obstructing the highway. And there isn't enough teeth in the punishment to deal with that. And that's why we need some legislation. That's why the government have got this injunction in force, which is going to be reviewed on the 5th of October. It's going to carry on until the 21st of March of next year. So, but the problem is it only deals with the M25, and we need something much wider and much more rapid. I think government need to be burning the midnight oil, and I know they're about to have other matters to deal with, but this is a priority. And of course, the people behind this movement are aware of exactly what's happening in politics. This has been timed to perfection. They know exactly what they're doing. The government needs to counteract. There's no alternative.
I think there'll be many members of Parliament who agree with you exactly. Whether the government listens to them or not is another matter. Nick Freeman, criminal defence and motoring lawyer, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon on GB News. We'll be right back with more of today's top stories after these few short messages.